Welcome to F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. In this class, we'll explore two contemporary storytelling traditions that were long ignored by folklorists: personal narratives and family stories. Since early scholars were looking for the vestiges of older oral material, the traditional stories of the people, you might say, they weren't that concerned with the everyday stories that people told. You know, the ones about our everyday lives. Many of the genres of stories that we've discussed have waned a little bit in everyday life. Think myths and fairy tales, or even folk tales. As noted last time, even jokes are not as popular as they once were. However, personal stories remain a persistent aspect of our daily lives. These are the narratives we tell as we go about our daily comings and goings. These are the stories that we tell in our encounters with everyday people. They allow us to relive and relay our life experiences. Most of us share these stories with family and friends, co-workers and acquaintances, so a personal experience narrative would be like me telling a story about the time when I glued my eyes shut. When I was a kid, my sister used to bite her fingernails and wear artificial ones. I also had to put eye drops in my eyes for astigmatism. And one day, she put her glue in the medicine cabinet where I also kept my eye medicine. The next morning, I went to put drops in my eyes, and you guessed it, I glued my eye shut. But luckily, I blinked, and the eye was glued shut rather than being blinded. My mom drove me to the hospital emergency room, and they sent me to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor looked at me, and he sent me back over to the hospital. The story has several twists and turns in it that are pretty humorous, but I'm not going to bore you with that right now. But I just want to say that would be an example of a personal experience story. It's a real event that happens, but something funny happens. Through telling these stories, we burnish them, we polish them, we find out what people react to, and we put more of that in, or we make that tighter. We find the parts that bore people, and we pull back on those sorts of things. In a pinch, I can humorously tell an appropriate version of that story based upon the people who are around me. An emerita professor, Sandra Dolby, from here at Indiana University, she really kind of pioneered the work on personal experience narratives, and she defined it this way. The personal narrative is a prose narrative relating to a personal experience. I know, that's kind of obvious. It is usually told in first person, and its content is non-traditional. Now, by non-traditional, Sandy means that it's not based upon the same structures and motifs that you would find in legends and folk tales, but rather they're invested with the observations of everyday life, the lived experience. While the content may not be traditional, each of us have a repertoire of these stories that we tell, often just a handful of them that we've told over and over and over again. And we've transformed these somewhat mundane encounters and events into elaborate stories. In your reading for today, you learned about and read some of the stories of Homer Spriggs, an elder blacksmith and musician from Brummett's Creek, from near Bloomington here. He came from a family of storytellers, and he tells both personal experience stories as well as family stories that were passed down to him from his father and grandfather. He was considered the chronicler of Brummett's Creek. In a companion essay to that one, Dr. Jennifer Eastman Atterbury explores the aesthetics of the story that Spriggs tells. It's a nice article that I'll link to on Canvas. She focuses on the narrative devices that are part of the polishing process that I mentioned before. That is what transforms, as I said, these mundane events into an artfully told story. For example, Atterbury notes that Spriggs used repetitive words like old to create a rhythm and a pace to his stories. Here's an example. Old Uncle Adam Stevens, 100 years ago, lived up there, right where Uncle Joe was, built the place. And you know, one night he heard a piggy squealing, and he got up out of bed and got his old cane. He got his old cane and his lantern, and he went down to the hog lot, and there was an old grizzly bear in there trying to catch a pig. Now you, Scudder, now you've come to the wrong place, he says. I'll frail your old hide for you. He clumb over the fence, and he took his old cane and that lantern, and he beat that old sucker till he clumb out of there and left. He run him off. Repeating the word old, Spriggs engages the listener, creates a sense of continuity to his story, and forges a cohesive narrative. Another aspect of Spriggs' storytelling style is a pace. He quickly dived into the story with the hearing of the piggy squealing. He doesn't weight down the narrative with a lengthy introduction or backstory. The listener is instantly pulled into the action. The use of dialogue is also a narrative device that is common to storytelling, where the narrator takes on the personality of characters in the story. These are not just embellishments, it actually moves the story forward and draws the listener in. The author points out that this dialogue has two effects. First, it makes the story seem more realistic by pulling the audience directly into the midst of action. Second, the dialogue is not interrupted with the he said, she said types of things, but rather gives life to the characters as they self-narrate the actions of the story. Also, it is through the narration that characters come alive and you find out about them and what they're like. And this is what the author calls characterization. Also, throughout the narrative, Spriggs provides details about the situation and setting to support the dialogue and ground the story, which helps support the veracity of the tale, without being too much and slowing the story down. As the narrative moves the story forward, the contextual detail anchors it in a specific place and time. Finally, his short story is punctuated with active verbs. His stories are economical, leaning upon narration, specific contextual details, and active verbs to keep it tight and engaging. As you do your reading about Homer Spriggs for today, note how Spriggs accomplishes these things in the stories he tells. While some of Spriggs's stories are personal experience narratives, many of them are family stories. A branch of family folklore, these tales convey events that are retold as a means of maintaining a common family identity. For example, in my family, there's a story of my several great-grandfathers, who's also named John Kay, who invented this thing called the fly shuttle, which helped bring about industrial weaving, and by connection eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, the family story is that many of the weavers got so mad about his invention because they were going to be put out of work that he had to sneak out of England by sewing himself up in a bedsheet. He's a historical character, and I can find histories written about him, but not about the sneaking out of England in a bedsheet. That's the kind of family legend. But not all family stories are old. In fact, most are about the things that have happened in your own memory. The time my parents left my 4-year-old sister at a rest area on the trip to Florida. Me wrestling with a huge snapping turtle when I was a kid because my sister wanted it. These are the stories we remember, that we find meaning in, and we want to share. I'm sure each of you have these kinds of stories in your lives. I'm going to have you listen to a story from my friend Milano Passage. We'll talk about him a bit more later in this course. But this is an excerpt of a long storytelling session that I had with him. He had just found out that he had cancer and it was terminal. And he was basically telling me the story of his life. And this is a really short excerpt of a tale about having to have an unnecessary surgery just to get a job.
Everything I learned as far as skills, I learned from my brother. And we were closer than 2 coats of paint. He became president of the local, the union. And then toward his last days on earth, he came over one time and he told me, he says, "Kid," he says, "the unions have sold out." He was very despondent about that part. And of course in '58 there was a small recession. The boss's son and I went from being top labor grade tool and die makers to sweeping the tool room. And the older guys, made a lot of fun out of us, and we retaliated in the only way we knew how. We did dastardly tricks to them, like greasing up their machines with Limburger cheese, painting their heels white when they weren't looking. I even painted the superintendent of the plant's heels one time. That didn't go over too good. My brother, he says, "What is the matter with you?" He says, "You're a married man with a newborn child." He says, "You could lose your job over this." Well, he straightened my act out. Then one day he caught Bob Shearer and I together and he says, "You guys don't like this work anymore," and we were pretty vocal by then. So he said to Bob Shearer, he says, "Would you like to be a Gary policeman?" And Bob says, "Policeman?" He says, "Oh, I'd love it." He says to me, "You want to be a fireman?" And I says, "Just get me out of here. I don't want to be here anymore." I had spent 11 years there. So he takes us down to City Hall chambers that night. He knows the mayor. The guy's a half-breed like me. His name was Peter Mandich. So Mandich says to my brother, "What can I do for you, Bob?" And he says, "My kid brother wants to be a fireman, and Bob here wants to be a policeman." He says, "Okay, so he's a cop and he's a fireman. What are we going to talk about now?" Okay. That part was real easy. But now we go through our hospital checkups, and we both passed with flying colors. And then we had to go to the pension doctors, firemen's pension doctors and police pensioners' doctors. So I go to the fireman's pension doctor. He hardly looks at me, and he tells me, "You can't get on the job. You've got a double hernia." John, I didn't even know what a hernia was. So I came home that night, and I told my brother, he says, "I can't get on. I got a double hernia." He says, "Tomorrow morning you go to the U.S. Steel doctor and have him look at you." This guy was an All-American end. I can't remember his name today. But he says, "What's the problem?" I says, "I got pain across here. I think I got a double hernia." He says, "Okay, drop him." So he checks me out. He says, "There's nothing wrong with you." So I says, I think his name was Donchis. I says, "Well, I have to level with you now. I'm trying to get on the fire department, and this doctor is telling me I have this condition." He says, "What's his name?" And I gave him the name. He calls him up on the phone, and they argued for about a half hour. Finally, my doctor slams the phone down, and I says, "What?" He says, "I had to compromise." I says, "Look, what's that mean?" He says, "I'll have to cut you once." So I go through with it, and after the operation, he comes down into this. It wasn't a room. We didn't have separate rooms. It was where we were all in one area. I says, "What'd you find?" He says, he was so angry. He says, "Nothing." So, okay, I was glad to find out I was okay. But so I healed up for a month now. Now I report at the main station for duty, and they assign me where else? To the ghetto.
Like Homer, Milan employs several aesthetic devices to make his stories engaging, moving quickly through the story, providing only the necessary narrative details, focusing on the humorous and dramatic elements, and especially performing narration to make the story funny, entertaining, and credible. Personal experience stories punctuate our daily lives. They help us communicate who we are, what we believe, how we live in the world. Help us forge social bonds and connect us with others. While this is the last lecture that'll focus specifically on oral narratives, you'll find that these personal stories augment many of the other expressive practices we will discuss through the remainder of the course. In fact, in the next lecture, I'm going to focus on life story objects. These are material things that people make to help them tell life stories.